Officer Daniel Reeves barely glanced at the private hallway door after Naomi disappeared behind it. To him, she was already forgotten, just another woman who had spoken out of turn inside a courthouse where power moved according to badges, uniforms, and names etched onto office doors. He adjusted the cuffs on the teenage boy and guided him toward the defense table with rough impatience while whispers spread quietly through the courtroom gallery. The boy's mother sat in the second row clutching her purse so tightly her knuckles had turned pale. Every few seconds she looked toward the hallway Naomi had vanished into, confusion clouding her face. Something about the woman had felt different. Calm in a place built on intimidation. The courtroom itself carried the stale heaviness of old authority. Dark oak walls stretched toward a ceiling lined with brass chandeliers dulled by decades of dust and cigarette smoke from another era. Rainwater streaked slowly across the tall windows overlooking downtown Chicago while deputies chatted near the rear entrance as though nothing unusual had happened minutes earlier. Reeves settled near the prosecution table with the confidence of a man who had never truly been challenged. One younger deputy leaned toward him carefully. That woman looked familiar. Reeves scoffed under his breath. Yeah. Familiar like every activist who walks in here trying to tell cops how to do their jobs. A few nearby officers chuckled quietly. At the defense table, public defender Marcus Hill opened a thick case file but kept glancing toward the courtroom doors. He had seen the entire incident in the hallway and the unease sitting in his chest refused to disappear. There had been something unsettling about the way Naomi carried herself afterward. No shouting. No threats. No panic. Just silence. Experienced trial attorneys recognized that kind of silence. It usually belonged to people who did not need to prove anything. Across the room, the court clerk shuffled papers nervously while checking the wall clock again and again. "Judge Carter is late," she whispered to the bailiff. "That never happens." The bailiff frowned slightly. In 7 years working that courtroom, Naomi Carter had never arrived late to a single hearing. Not during blizzards. Not during power outages. Not even the winter morning Lakeshore Drive froze solid beneath 6 inches of ice. Punctuality was one of the many things she was known for. Reeves stretched comfortably in his chair, unaware several courthouse employees had begun exchanging uneasy looks. One older clerk near the jury box slowly removed her reading glasses after finally recognizing the woman from the hallway. Her mouth parted slightly in disbelief. "Oh no," she murmured under her breath. Before anyone could ask what she meant, the side door near the judge's chambers clicked open softly. Instantly, the courtroom shifted. Deputies straightened. Lawyers rose halfway from their chairs. The low hum of conversation disappeared beneath the heavy silence rolling across the room. The bailiff stepped forward, voice echoing sharply against the wooden walls. "All rise." Chairs scraped backward across the floor. Reeves stood casually at first, still adjusting paperwork in his hands. Then he looked up. The color drained from his face so quickly it almost seemed unreal. Naomi Carter emerged from the private hallway wearing a long black judicial robe draped neatly over her shoulders. Her expression remained calm, unreadable, but the faint redness near her cheek still lingered beneath the courtroom lights. She walked with measured composure past the stunned attorneys and frozen deputies, each step echoing softly across the marble floor. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Reeves stared as though his mind could not process what he was seeing. The woman he had humiliated in the hallway was no protester, no defendant's relative, no bystander. She was the chief judge assigned to oversee police conduct hearings in Cook County Criminal Court. Naomi reached the bench slowly and placed her files down with careful precision. The courtroom remained standing in absolute silence as she lifted her eyes for the first time and looked directly at Officer Daniel Reeves. The silence inside courtroom 4B felt unnatural, heavy enough to press against every chest in the room. Judge Naomi Carter stood motionless behind the bench while rain continued sliding down the tall courthouse windows behind her like thin silver lines. Officer Daniel Reeves could not stop staring. His breathing had changed. Shorter now. Uneven. The confidence he carried only minutes earlier had vanished so completely that even the younger deputies beside him noticed it. Naomi opened the case file in front of her carefully, the soft sound of paper turning somehow louder than anything else in the courtroom. She did not look angry. That unsettled Reeves more than if she had shouted. Her composure made the entire room feel smaller. Controlled. "Be seated," Naomi said calmly. Every chair moved at once except Reeves, who remained frozen for half a second too long before lowering himself stiffly beside the prosecution table. The teenage defendant stared at Naomi with wide eyes while his mother quietly wiped tears from her face. Across the courtroom, Marcus Hill watched Naomi closely, realizing for the first time why she had seemed familiar. Naomi Carter was not simply respected in Cook County. She was feared by dishonest officers and admired by attorneys who still believed the justice system could work when placed in the right hands. She had built a reputation over 12 years for dismantling corruption with patience instead of theatrics. Naomi adjusted her glasses slightly and scanned the courtroom once before speaking again. "Before we begin today's hearing, I would like clarification regarding an incident that occurred outside this courtroom approximately 4 minutes ago." Nobody moved. Even the ceiling fan seemed quieter. Reeves swallowed hard but kept his eyes fixed forward. Naomi's voice never rose. "Officer Reeves," she continued softly, "would you like to explain your conduct toward a civilian in the courthouse hallway?" Reeves finally looked up. The redness had spread visibly across his neck now. "Your Honor, I did not realize," Naomi lifted one hand gently, stopping him immediately. "You did not realize who I was." Her words landed harder than yelling ever could have. The courtroom remained absolutely still. Naomi folded her hands together atop the bench. "That is not the issue." Reeves opened his mouth again, but nothing came out. For the first time in years, he looked like a man completely stripped of certainty. Naomi's eyes moved briefly toward the teenage defendant sitting beside his attorney. "This courtroom does not operate on assumptions about status, race, income, appearance, or profession," she said. "Every individual who enters this building deserves dignity, including people you believe hold no authority." Several courthouse employees lowered their eyes quietly. A few jurors waiting in the back hallway had stopped outside the open doors, listening in silence. Reeves shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The older deputy beside him stared straight ahead, clearly wanting no connection to what had happened. Naomi reached for a small button near the bench microphone. "Clerk, please request courthouse security footage from the east hallway outside courtroom for B beginning at 9:14 this morning." The clerk blinked quickly. "Yes, Your Honor." Reeves looked stunned. "Your Honor, with respect, this is unnecessary." Naomi met his eyes directly for the first time since entering the bench. "Unnecessary," she repeated quietly. "A frightened child was handled aggressively in public. A citizen who objected was humiliated in a courthouse dedicated to justice. Explain to me, Officer Reeves, which part feels unnecessary to review." Reeves had no answer. The rain outside intensified slightly, tapping harder against the windows as if the city itself were listening. Naomi glanced once more at the young defendant whose cuffed hands rested nervously in his lap. Then her expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Remove the restraints from the minor," she said calmly. Reeves hesitated. That hesitation lasted barely 2 seconds, but everyone in the courtroom noticed it. Naomi's voice remained steady. "That was not a suggestion." Slowly, under the weight of dozens of silent eyes, Officer Daniel Reeves rose from his chair and walked toward the teenager with trembling hands. The metallic click of the handcuffs unlocking echoed through the courtroom with painful clarity. The teenage boy rubbed his wrists carefully, avoiding eye contact with everyone except Naomi Carter. She gave him a small nod, nothing dramatic, just enough to steady the panic still visible in his breathing. Officer Daniel Reeves stepped back slowly after removing the restraints, but his hands were no longer steady. The courtroom could feel it now. The shift. Power had moved. Not loudly. Quietly. Completely. Naomi watched the boy for a moment before turning toward the prosecution table again. "What is the minor charged with?" she asked calmly. Assistant District Attorney Stephen Collins cleared his throat and shuffled papers too quickly. "Petty shoplifting, Your Honor. Value estimated at $38.40. Naomi looked down at the case file. "First offense." "Yes, Your Honor." "School record." Collins hesitated. "Honor roll student." "No prior disciplinary history." Naomi leaned back slightly in her chair. The rain outside had softened again, leaving faint streaks of water against the tall courthouse windows while weak morning sunlight slowly filtered through the gray clouds. It painted thin gold lines across the courtroom floor. Naomi's voice remained even. "Then why was this child treated like a violent offender?" Nobody answered immediately. Reeves stared down at the floor now, jaw tight, while several deputies near the back wall shifted uncomfortably. The boy's mother finally spoke through trembling breath. "He stole cough medicine and bread," she whispered. "His little sister has pneumonia." The room went silent again. Marcus Hill lowered his eyes briefly. Even Collins looked uncomfortable now. Naomi folded her hands together carefully. "How old is the sister?" 6, the mother answered quietly. "She has asthma too." Reeves exhaled slowly through his nose as though regretting every second that had led him into this courtroom. Naomi opened the file again and studied it for several long seconds. "The arrest report states the defendant cooperated immediately," she said. "No resistance. No threat. No attempt to flee." Collins nodded once. "Correct, Your Honor." Naomi looked toward Reeves without changing her expression. Yet witnesses observed unnecessary aggression during transport into this courtroom. Reeves finally spoke, though his voice had lost nearly all confidence. "Your Honor, I was following procedure." Naomi tilted her head slightly. "Procedure requires professionalism, not intimidation." The words landed softly but cut through the room sharper than shouting. Near the rear benches, an older janitor paused while mopping the hallway outside the open courtroom doors, listening quietly like everyone else in the building seemed to be doing now. Naomi's reputation had spread through the courthouse long before today. She was known for seeing people others overlooked. Especially children. Especially black children. The court clerk entered quietly carrying a flash drive in both hands. "Security footage, Your Honor." Reeves closed his eyes briefly. Naomi accepted the drive without rushing. She did not insert it immediately. Instead, she rested it beside her files and looked directly at Reeves again. "Do you know why respect matters in a courtroom, officer?" Reeves swallowed hard. "Because this building represents the law," he answered carefully. Naomi shook her head once. "No. Because frightened people walk in here every single day trusting strangers with their futures." Her gaze shifted briefly toward the teenage boy beside his attorney. "When authority forgets compassion, justice becomes fear wearing a uniform." Nobody wrote notes anymore. Nobody whispered. Even the air conditioning hum felt distant beneath the weight of her words. Naomi finally inserted the security footage into the courtroom monitor system. The screen flickered softly above the jury box. A frozen image appeared from the hallway outside courtroom 4B. Reeves standing over Naomi beside scattered papers across the marble floor. Several jurors waiting outside gasped quietly at the sight. Reeves stared at the screen as if seeing himself clearly for the first time. Naomi did not look at the monitor. She looked only at him. "Officer Reeves," she said softly, "is there anything you would like to say before this footage becomes part of the official record?" Officer Daniel Reeves stared at the frozen security image glowing above the jury box while the entire courtroom waited for his answer. The monitor captured every detail with brutal clarity. Naomi Carter standing near the wall holding legal files against her chest. Reeves towering over her with anger across his face. The frightened teenage boy only feet away in handcuffs. Even without sound, the image carried enough truth to make several people look away uncomfortably. Reeves loosened his collar slightly. Tiny beads of sweat had formed near his temple beneath the harsh courtroom lights. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "I may have handled the situation too aggressively." Naomi remained still behind the bench. "Too aggressively," she repeated softly. Reeves swallowed hard. "Yes." Naomi glanced briefly toward the courtroom monitor again before looking back at him. "Interesting wording." Her voice stayed calm, but the silence surrounding it carried weight that settled into every corner of the room. Marcus Hill folded his hands together slowly, watching Reeves unravel in real time. Prosecutor Stephen Collins avoided eye contact completely now. Even the younger deputy standing near the rear wall looked uneasy. Nobody wanted to be connected to the image frozen on that screen. Naomi leaned forward slightly. "You assumed I did not belong here because of how I looked." Reeves opened his mouth but hesitated. That hesitation said enough. Naomi continued before he could answer. "You saw a black woman in a rain-soaked coat speaking up for a child, and your first instinct was not professionalism. It was dismissal." Reeves lowered his eyes. The teenage defendant watched silently from beside Marcus Hill, his hands now free in his lap for the first time that morning. Naomi's expression softened for only a brief moment when she looked toward him. Then her attention returned to Reeves. "Do you know how many people enter courthouses already afraid?" she asked quietly. "Victims. Children. Families. People who cannot afford expensive lawyers. People who already believe the system was never built to protect them." Reeves said nothing. Naomi's voice never rose above calm conversation, yet every word landed with painful precision. When authority humiliates someone publicly, especially inside a courthouse, the damage reaches beyond one moment. It teaches. Everyone watching that dignity depends on status. A faint rumble of thunder rolled somewhere outside across the Chicago skyline. The courtroom lights flickered once before stabilizing again. Nobody moved. Naomi slowly removed her glasses and set them atop the case file. "I grew up 6 blocks from this courthouse," she said. Several people looked surprised. "My mother cleaned office buildings at night. My father drove a city bus for 23 years. Reeves finally looked up again. Naomi continued calmly. "The first time I walked into this building as a teenager, a deputy asked if I was lost." Her eyes locked onto Reeves now. "I still remember how small that moment made me feel." The courtroom remained silent enough to hear rainwater tapping softly against the windows again. Naomi folded her hands together carefully. "That is why respect matters here." Reeves looked as though he wanted to disappear entirely. His confidence had collapsed into visible shame now. The older deputy beside him shifted awkwardly before quietly stepping farther away. Naomi glanced toward the court clerk. "Add the security footage to the official record and notify Internal Affairs regarding Officer Reeves' pending review." The clerk nodded immediately. Reeves inhaled sharply. "Your Honor, please. I have served this department for 14 years. Naomi met his eyes without anger. "Then you should understand accountability better than most." Her words carried no cruelty. That somehow made them harder to escape. Reeves looked toward the floor again while courthouse employees quietly exchanged glances across the room. Naomi turned one final page inside the teenager's case file. "As for the minor defendant," she said calmly, "this court finds community hardship and lack of criminal history significant mitigating factors." The boy's mother covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes again. Naomi looked toward the frightened teenager whose shoulders still carried the tension of the morning. "Young man," she said gently, "one mistake does not decide the rest of your life." For the first time since entering the courthouse, the boy finally lifted his head completely. The teenage boy stared at Naomi Carter as though he had never heard an adult speak to him with kindness inside a courtroom before. His breathing slowed little by little while his mother quietly cried beside him, one trembling hand pressed against her chest. Outside, the storm clouds over Chicago had begun to thin, and pale morning light stretched through the tall courthouse windows in soft golden strips that reached across the dark wooden floor. Naomi glanced down at the case file one last time before closing it gently. This court recommends immediate dismissal pending completion of 20 hours of community service and academic counseling support, she said calmly. Prosecutor Stephen Collins nodded without argument. The state agrees, Your Honor. Relief moved visibly across the boy's face so suddenly it almost looked painful. His mother covered her mouth, tears slipping freely now as she whispered, "Thank you." Naomi gave her a small nod, quiet and human, before turning her attention back toward the courtroom itself. The air had changed completely since the beginning of the hearing. Earlier that morning, the room had felt cold, mechanical, ruled by fear and routine. Now there was something else lingering beneath the silence. Reflection. Several deputies stood motionless near the walls, avoiding eye contact with Officer Daniel Reeves, who remained seated beside the prosecution table looking smaller than he had an hour ago. The courtroom monitor still displayed the frozen hallway image above the jury box. Naomi standing beside scattered papers. Reeves towering over her. Nobody had asked for the image to be removed. Perhaps because everyone understood the photograph had become something larger than evidence now. It was a mirror. Naomi removed the flash drive from the monitor system slowly and handed it back to the clerk. "Ensure a duplicate copy is secured," she said. "Yes, Your Honor." The clerk accepted it carefully, almost respectfully. Reeves finally lifted his eyes again. Shame had settled heavily across his face now, replacing the arrogance that once defined him. Naomi noticed it immediately. She had seen that look before. Some people only understood their own cruelty once they were forced to witness it from outside themselves. The rain had stopped completely by then. Sunlight touched the edge of Naomi's judicial bench, warming the polished wood with a soft amber glow. Dust floated quietly through the light like tiny drifting particles suspended in silence. Naomi rested both hands calmly atop the bench and looked directly at Reeves. "Officer," she said softly, "do you know what frightened me most this morning?" Reeves swallowed hard but answered honestly. "No, Your Honor." Naomi's eyes moved briefly toward the courtroom doors behind him. "Not your anger." The room remained perfectly still. "Not your assumptions." She paused for a moment. It was how comfortable everyone else had become watching it happen. Several people lowered their heads immediately. Marcus Hill looked toward the floor. Even Collins shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Naomi's voice never changed volume. "Silence can protect dignity," she continued quietly. "But it can also protect injustice." The word settled over the courtroom heavier than any sentence she had spoken all morning. Reeves looked shaken now in a way deeper than embarrassment. The younger deputy standing near the rear wall slowly removed his police cap and held it against his chest without realizing he had done it. Naomi exhaled softly and leaned back slightly in her chair. For a brief second, exhaustion crossed her face. Not physical exhaustion. Something older. The kind carried by people who spent years proving they belonged in rooms that questioned them the moment they entered. Then the expression disappeared, replaced once again by composure. Naomi glanced toward the teenage defendant. "Take care of your sister," she said gently. The boy nodded quickly, eyes wet with emotion. "Yes, m." His mother reached for his hand tightly as though afraid this moment might disappear if she let go. Naomi gave one final look across the courtroom before lifting the small wooden gavel beside her files. The sound echoed once through the chamber. Firm. Clean. Final. Court is adjourned. Yet nobody stood immediately. Nobody rushed for the exits. Because somewhere between the hallway humiliation and the closing strike of that gavel, everyone inside courtroom for B understood they had witnessed something far bigger than a hearing. People began leaving courtroom for B slowly, almost reluctantly, as though stepping back into the normal world too quickly would break whatever had shifted inside that room. The teenage boy walked beside his mother through the courthouse aisle with his shoulders lighter than before, and for the first time all morning, he looked like a child instead of a defendant. Several courthouse employees quietly stepped aside to let them pass. One older bailiff even nodded respectfully toward the boy's mother before lowering his eyes. Small gestures. Quiet gestures. But she noticed every one of them. Near the front of the courtroom, Officer Daniel Reeves remained seated alone while the other deputies filtered toward the hallway without speaking to him. The isolation settled around him slowly and completely. A few hours earlier he had carried himself like a man untouchable inside those walls. Now even the sound of distant footsteps outside the courtroom seemed louder than his breathing. Naomi Carter gathered her files carefully behind the bench. Her movement stayed calm, practiced, deliberate. No victory sat on her face. No satisfaction. Only the exhaustion of someone who understood moments like this did not erase years of damage. The courtroom doors creaked open again and a gray-haired man in a dark navy suit stepped quietly inside. Chief Marshal Robert Gaines. Every deputy in the courthouse knew him instantly. Reeves straightened the moment he saw him. Gaines looked first toward Naomi. "Judge Carter," he said respectfully. Naomi nodded once. "Marshal Gaines." His eyes drifted briefly toward the courtroom monitor still displaying the frozen hallway image. The silence between the three of them stretched heavily. Finally Gaines turned toward Reeves. "Badge." Reeves froze. The word landed softly, but it carried finality. Reeves looked down at the silver shield pinned to his uniform chest. His hands trembled slightly as he unclipped it. For 14 years that badge had represented authority, certainty, identity. Now it felt heavier than metal. Gaines accepted it without emotion. "Your service weapon and courthouse credentials will be surrendered downstairs pending investigation." Reeves nodded once, unable to speak immediately. Naomi watched quietly from behind the bench while sunlight continued pouring through the courthouse windows in warm gold streaks. Outside, the storm had fully passed. Chicago traffic moved again below the courthouse steps, horns echoing faintly through the city. Life continuing as it always did. Reeves finally lifted his eyes toward Naomi. "Your Honor," his voice cracked slightly before he steadied it. "I was wrong." Naomi said nothing at first. Reeves swallowed hard. "Not just today." The courtroom remained completely still except for the low hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Reeves glanced toward the frozen security image on the monitor. "I think," he stopped briefly, searching for words he had likely never spoken before. "I think I stopped seeing people individually a long time ago." Naomi studied him carefully. No anger crossed her face now. Only sadness. The kind that came from hearing a truth too late. Reeves exhaled shakily. "I told myself I was maintaining control. Keeping order." But somewhere along the way, his eyes lowered. "I forgot people carry fear into these buildings." Marshal Gaines remained silent near the aisle, allowing the moment to unfold without interruption. Naomi stepped down slowly from behind the bench for the first time since adjournment. The black judicial robe moved softly around her shoulders as she approached Reeves across the polished courtroom floor. She stopped several feet away. Close enough for him to see the faint redness still lingering near her cheek beneath the afternoon light. Reeves looked ashamed all over again. Naomi's voice stayed gentle. "Authority is tested most when the person standing in front of you appears powerless." Reeves nodded silently. Naomi folded her hands together. "Real justice is not measured by how we treat important people." Her eyes held his steadily. "It is measured by how we treat the people we believe cannot fight back." The word settled into the empty courtroom with quiet permanence. Reeves looked down at the missing place on his uniform where the badge had been moments earlier. For the first time in years, he understood how small a person could feel inside a courthouse. The courthouse had grown quieter by late afternoon. Most of the lawyers had already disappeared into elevators and parking garages while janitors moved slowly through the marble hallways with rolling trash bins and the scent of fresh floor polish trailing behind them. Inside courtroom 4B, the sunlight had shifted lower now, stretching long amber shadows across the empty benches where frightened families had sat only hours earlier. Naomi Carter stood near the tall windows, gathering the last of her files into a leather briefcase worn softly at the corners from years of use. The city skyline glowed beneath fading storm clouds while distant sirens echoed somewhere far below. Behind her, Officer Daniel Reeves still had not left. Without the badge on his chest, he looked strangely ordinary. Smaller somehow. Human in a way authority had hidden for years. Marshal Gaines had stepped outside moments earlier to handle paperwork downstairs, leaving the courtroom suspended in heavy silence once again. Reeves finally spoke, though quietly this time. "Why did you defend that kid?" Naomi paused beside the window but did not turn around immediately. "Because nobody else was." Reeves lowered his eyes. "You did not even know him." Naomi looked out across the city streets below where tiny figures hurried beneath wet sidewalks and flashing traffic lights. A frightened child should not need to earn basic dignity before adults decide to show it. Reeves leaned back slowly into the wooden chair behind him. The courtroom lights reflected faintly against the polished floor between them. "I think somewhere along the way," he admitted carefully, "I stopped seeing people as people." Naomi turned then, studying him with the same calm expression she had carried all day. There was no triumph in her face. No revenge. Only honesty. Reeves rubbed his palms together nervously. Every shift became another argument. Another threat. Another person yelling at me. After years of it, he exhaled heavily. "You stop listening." Naomi walked slowly toward the first row of benches and rested one hand lightly against the polished oak railing. "Pain can harden people," she said softly. "But it does not excuse cruelty." Reeves nodded once. The words hit because they were true. Simple truths always hit hardest. Outside the courtroom doors, a young deputy quietly paused after overhearing their conversation. He remained still in the hallway listening without meaning to. Naomi glanced toward the courtroom monitor where the frozen hallway image still remained untouched. "Do you know what frightened that boy most today?" Reeves looked at the screen silently. Naomi answered before he could try. "Not the handcuffs." Her voice lowered slightly. It was believing nobody would care what happened to him after they were placed there. The courtroom fell silent again. Reeves stared at the image for several long seconds. Then slowly, almost painfully, he stood up and walked toward the monitor. He looked at himself frozen on that screen beside Naomi's scattered papers. For the first time all day, he did not defend what he saw. He looked ashamed of it. Truly ashamed. Naomi watched quietly while the final sunlight of evening touched the courtroom walls in soft gold. Reeves swallowed hard before speaking again. "I do not know how to undo years of becoming someone I barely recognize anymore." Naomi's expression softened slightly. "You start by recognizing it." Reeves looked back toward her. Naomi folded her hands together calmly. "Accountability is not humiliation. It is an opportunity." The word settled deeply into the room. Reeves glanced down at the empty space on his uniform chest where the badge had once rested. "Do you think people can really change?" Naomi looked toward the courtroom doors where frightened families entered every single day hoping someone inside those walls would still see their humanity. "Only if they stop confusing power with worth," she answered quietly. The young deputy standing outside the hallway lowered his eyes thoughtfully before walking away in silence. Reeves remained standing beside the monitor while Naomi closed her briefcase gently. Neither spoke again for several moments. The courthouse no longer felt cold now. Just quiet. Like something old inside the building had finally been forced into the light. Night settled slowly over downtown Chicago, washing the courthouse windows in deep blue reflections while the last traces of sunlight disappeared behind the skyline. Courtroom 4B now sat almost completely empty except for the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the faint sound of rainwater dripping somewhere outside onto the courthouse steps below. Judge Naomi Carter stood alone near the bench for a long moment after Officer Daniel Reeves finally left the room with Marshal Gaines. She watched the door close quietly behind them, then lowered her eyes toward the polished wooden floor where her papers had scattered earlier that morning. The building felt different now. Quieter in a way that had nothing to do with sound. Naomi exhaled slowly and removed her judicial robe, folding it carefully over one arm before gathering the last of her files into her worn leather briefcase. The faint redness near her cheek had nearly faded beneath the soft evening light, but the memory of the hallway still lingered. Not because of humiliation. Because of recognition. She had spent years inside courtrooms watching people shrink beneath authority. Children. Mothers. Elderly men. Defendants too poor to afford tailored suits or polished language. People who entered buildings like this already believing their dignity could be taken from them in seconds. Today, for a brief moment, she had stood exactly where they stood. And the truth of that sat heavily in her chest. Naomi walked slowly down the center aisle between the empty benches. Her heels echoed softly across the marble floor, steady and measured beneath the dim courthouse lights. As she reached the courtroom doors, she noticed something resting quietly beside the entrance railing. A folded note. She paused, then picked it up carefully. The handwriting was uneven, rushed. Probably written by the teenage boy from earlier. Naomi unfolded it slowly. "Thank you for seeing me like a person." Just one sentence. Nothing more. Naomi stared at the words for several seconds while distant thunder rolled faintly somewhere beyond the city. Skyline. Her eyes softened. Not with sadness. With something quieter. Relief, maybe. The kind that came when compassion survived a place designed to wear it down. She folded the note carefully and slipped it into her briefcase beside the case files. Down the hallway, courthouse employees moved through the building, shutting off lights one section at a time. Darkness slowly claimed the empty corridors behind them. Naomi stepped out into the long marble hallway where everything had started that morning. The polished floor reflected the overhead lights in pale silver streaks. She stopped briefly near the exact spot where her papers had fallen hours earlier. The hallway looked ordinary now. Clean. Silent. Yet the air still carried the weight of what had happened there. Naomi glanced toward the tall courthouse windows at the end of the corridor. Rainwater slid slowly down the glass while city lights flickered across the wet streets below. Somewhere outside, car horns echoed faintly through the cold evening air. Life moving forward. Always moving forward. A young courthouse janitor passed pushing a cleaning cart and offered Naomi a quiet smile. "Good night, Judge Carter." Naomi returned the smile gently. "Good night." She continued walking toward the elevators, her footsteps calm and unhurried. Behind her, courtroom for B remained dark except for one final light above the judge's bench. The golden glow illuminated the carved wooden nameplate resting at the center. Honorable Naomi Carter. The hallway fell silent again as the elevator doors slowly closed around her reflection. And somewhere deep inside that old courthouse, long after everyone else had gone home, the sound of justice still lingered in the quiet.